Welcome to the global launch of the World Justice Project's 2021 Rule of Law Index. My name is Elizabeth Anderson, and I'm the Executive Director of the World Justice Project, and I'll be your host for today's program. We've got a great program planned for you. You'll be hearing about the latest index findings from WJP's Chief Research Officer, Alejandro Ponce, and from Index Co-Director, Alicia Evangelidis. You'll also hear from colleagues from government, civil society, the academy, and business about their perspectives on the rule of law, why it matters, why measuring it matters, and what they do with the index data in their work every day. But first, let me turn to WJP's co-founder and CEO, Bill Newcomb, for a word of welcome.
Welcome to the launch of the 2021 Rule of Law Index. We at the World Justice Project are eager to share this year's index data with people from all over the globe by means of this live digital event. Over the past decade, our Rule of Law Index has become recognized as the world's leading source for original rule of law data. It is an indispensable tool with which we can improve understanding of rule of law dynamics, identify areas for improvement, and track progression and regression worldwide. This year's results show a continuing pattern of regression, fortunately, made worse by the COVID-19 pandemic, which has laid bare systemic inequalities and weaknesses in the rule of law performance in many countries. The erosion of the rule of law should be a concern to all of us, because the rule of law is the very foundation for functional communities, that is, communities that deliver justice, opportunity, and peace. Important correlations have become clear. The more rule of law, more economic development in the country. More rule of law corresponds to better health outcomes and public education. And where we have more rule of law, we see more peace. This year's findings are surely a call to action, and all of us have a role to play in advancing the rule of law, whether you might be a member of government, a civil society worker, a business person, an educator, or a member of the media. You can use this diagnostic tool, this Rule of Law Index, to identify and remedy justice issues in your respective communities. So thank you for joining us today and for your work in advancing the rule of law in these critically important times.
Thank you, Bill. I'm joined here by WJP Chief Research Officer Alejandro Ponce and Index Co-Director Alicia Evangelidis. They lead this work and will be sharing the findings, and will start us off with a brief introduction to the index. Alex and Alicia, for those in our audience who are less familiar with the index, tell us about it. What is it, and how does it measure the rule of law?
Thank you, Betsy. We're very excited to be here to be presenting the results of the 2021 World Justice Project Rule of Law Index. The report that we're presenting today summarizes the experiences and perceptions of more than 130,000 people and 4,200 experts interviewed in 139 countries about their dealings with the government, the police, the courts, the accountability and openness of their governments, the extent of corruption, the protection of fundamental rights, or the extent of violence to which they are exposed. All this information is organized into 8 outcome indicators: constraints on our powers, absence of corruption, open government, fundamental right, civil justice, criminal justice, regulatory enforcement. All of these indicators are further disaggregated into 44 sub-indicators or sub-factors and into 550 or more than 550 individual questions.
So to measure the rule of law in each country, we administer surveys to the general public, experts, legal practitioners in each country and jurisdiction that is covered by the index. You can find all of the 2021 index data in our index, and we've also summarized the main findings of our index data in our Insights booklet, both of which are beautifully designed, and you can see right here. Yes, we're really excited. They are live now. You can also so both of these reports, as I said, are live on our website, in addition to our interactive data portal, so you can actually do your own analysis using that portal. And we really encourage everyone to dig in and explore the data, all of which is available on our website now.
Wonderful. So that's an enormous effort to gather all that data and a great resource. I'm sure we're all very excited to hear about the results. If you're in the audience and if you have questions about the methodology or the findings, please let me encourage you to post those to the comment section on the screen, and we'll turn in a moment later in the program to answering some of those questions. But before we move on to the findings, let's hear some perspectives from some of our colleagues in organizations and institutions around the world. Let's hear how they think about the rule of law, why it's important in their work.
Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are in this world. Justice and the rule of law are critical to making transformative change across societies. When there is no justice or access to it, poverty remains rampant and inequalities persist. The rule of law fosters development because it strengthens the voices of individuals and communities. It also provides access to justice, ensures due process, and establishes remedies for the violation of rights. This is where organizations such as the World Justice Project come into play and can guide us forward. One of the World Justice Project's most important contributions in the justice sphere is its yearly index, which looks at the state of the rule of law around the world.
Yo creo que hay que señalar categóricamente que el Estado de Derecho es imprescindible para el desarrollo de un país democrático, ya que este Estado establece un marco jurídico que parte del principio de respetar a la sociedad y de la obligación de las autoridades para garantizar los derechos y las libertades de las personas a las cuales representa. La adherencia al Estado de Derecho establece un piso mínimo en el ejercicio de derechos y libertades que deben irse ampliando progresivamente, reconociendo el ejercicio pleno de todas las personas a los derechos que garantiza la ley.
I am a fan of the World Justice Project and its Rule of Law Index. It's really important to measure where we are and where we're going. Are we going forward? We're going backward. That's why I love data, because data really guide us and help us to see where we're going. This is the importance really of the Rule of Law Index, and I imagine it is wonderful for us. It's not only for people in the legal professions to look at, it is for politicians, it is for business also. Do people respect contracts, agreements? Can you have a recourse to court if somebody messes you up?
As a former Minister of Justice, former Attorney General, I know how important it is to be able to measure the impact of the rule of law in the daily life of the people. So such a tool will help decision makers in and out of government, civil society, human rights activists to pinpoint trouble spots in order to apply corrective measures.
Certainly as a global participant in the business community, we at Microsoft see that we really have an even more pressing need for the rule of law than perhaps ever before. As we work in countries around the world, we see just every day the need for laws that are publicly promulgated so we can all read them. You know, we understand the importance of having confidence in knowing that those laws will be applied equitably and fairly, and that they'll be subject to independent adjudication. And we also appreciate just how vital it is to ensure that the rule of law is consistent with fundamental norms for the protection of human rights. And yet, as this index makes clear, COVID-19 has not been kind to the rule of law. We've gone through now a year and a half where many governments in many countries have used the pandemic to tighten restrictions, to strengthen rules, and in the process, unfortunately, also undermine the rule of law. So we are at a moment in time when we need to not just read this index as we do every year at Microsoft as we make use of it in our business, but I think also use it as a source of inspiration. Inspiration for the future we want to build, and also inspiration to remind us of the abuses that we have to fight if we're going to succeed in avoiding them.
So you've heard from these colleagues about the foundational importance of the rule of law. Whether you work in business, in government, in civil society, or in the academy, I hope that you too will find this data useful, that it will, as Brad Smith suggests, inspire you to take action to strengthen the rule of law. Alex and Alicia, it's time now to turn to you for the 2021 findings and share with us what do the data tell us about that action that we need to take.
Great, thank you. Well, let's turn now to the main highlights and findings of the 2021 World Justice Project's Rule of Law Index. This year, the World Justice Project added 11 new countries to the index, 7 in the European Union, 2 in Latin America and the Caribbean, and 2 in Sub-Saharan Africa. With the addition of these countries, we've now increased our coverage to 139 countries around the world. The index now covers the entire European Union, 33 countries in Sub-Saharan Africa, and 32 countries in Latin America and the Caribbean. And we're really looking forward to increasing our coverage in future years. In 2021, the top regional performers in overall rule of law are Uruguay, Denmark, Georgia, Nepal, United Arab Emirates, Rwanda, and New Zealand, while the bottom regional performers are Venezuela, Hungary, Turkey, Afghanistan, Egypt, Democratic Republic of Congo, and Cambodia. The countries with the biggest improvements in rule of law in the past year were Uzbekistan, Moldova, and Mongolia. And the countries with the biggest decline in the past year were Belarus and Myanmar. Nigeria, Nicaragua, Kyrgyz Republic, and Argentina tie for the third biggest decline. The 2021 edition of the WJP Rule of Law Index shows that more countries declined than improved in overall rule of law performance for the 4th consecutive year. During the past year, approximately 74% of countries covered by the index experienced declines in rule of law performance, while only 26% improved. The countries that experienced these declines account for approximately 85% of the world's population. This is equivalent to approximately 6.5 billion people. And these declines were widespread and were seen in all corners of the world.
Well, these trends reflect not only the effect of the pandemic, but also an environment of rising authoritarianism. Out of the countries that declined this year, 28% of the countries have been declining for 2 years in a row, and 35% for 3 years in a row. The effect of the pandemic, however, has shown in various dimensions of the rule of law. Let's look at them.
In a year that was dominated by the global COVID-19 pandemic, more than half of countries experienced declines in constraints on government powers, civic space, timeliness of justice, and absence of discrimination. During the last year, 70% of indexed countries declined in constraints on government powers. This decline was the most prevalent in South Asia, the Middle East and North Africa, and the EU, EFTA, and North America region. 82% of indexed countries experienced a decline in at least one dimension of civic space, as measured by civic participation, freedom of opinion and association, freedom of opinion and expression, and freedom of assembly and association. 94% of indexed countries experienced increased delays in administrative, civil, or criminal proceedings. In nearly 2/3 of countries, civil justice systems exhibited these increased delays. 67% of countries covered by the index experienced declines in equal treatment and absence of discrimination. This decline was the most prevalent in sub-Saharan Africa and the Middle East and North Africa.
Well, as we have seen in most countries, the COVID-19 pandemic and the measures to contain it had negative effects on the constraints of the power of the executive and the performance of institutions. So this came about through 3 different channels. So the first one was the weakening of institutional checks and the closing of civic space in a context of growing authoritarianism and low trust in governments. As we have seen in the data, this is the 4th year in a row in which more countries declined in rule of law scores, and in particular in the scores of constraints on government powers and fundamental rights. The pandemic spread those effects to more countries and accelerated those effects in countries that were already declining. The second channel was the stress that the pandemic imposed on justice institutions, manifested through delays in civil, criminal, administrative proceedings, and problems of access. And the third one was through an increase in discrimination against vulnerable groups, which is due in part by the unequal effects and measures to contain the pandemic, but also due to some structural factors.
Yeah, so the findings that we've identified really extend across regions and all across the world. You can find more about these trends and country-specific data in our index report and our insights report and on our interactive data site. And we invite everyone to use the QR code that you see on your screen and to visit our website at worldjusticeproject.org to find more information about the rule of law in your country or region.
Well, thank you very much for that survey of the findings. It's a sobering picture, to be sure. We certainly see in the data what we sense as this spreading rule of law recession around the world. I'm sure our audience has many questions. Let me remind you again to post those questions in the comments section on the screen, and we'll turn to those momentarily. But first, let's turn again to some of our colleagues in various institutions around the world to get their reactions to the findings and to hear from them how they intend to use this data to address the concerns that have been highlighted.
Let me start by congratulating the World Justice Programme for the launch of the 2021 Rule of Law Index. Your work helps us foster and promote a rule of law culture, and I welcome the fact that, for the first time, all 27 EU member states feature in the index. Rule of law, democracy and fundamental rights are the very foundations upon which the European Union is built. The rule of law is also central to making the European Union work well as an area of freedom, security and justice, and for creating an internal market where laws apply effectively and uniformly. We have unfortunately seen rule of law concerns emerging in certain member states over the past years. This decline shows also in the index. That is why we need to use all of the instruments at our disposal to uphold the rule of law.
The findings of the 2021 index are indeed grim. For the 4th year in a row, countries are showing more decline in overall rule of law performance. There is no emoji for that. It's not a laughing matter. This is really serious. This is particularly troubling when the world is under stress. Take, for instance, the ongoing COVID-19 pandemic and the ensuing humanitarian crisis in areas affected by conflict and violence. We must recognize that more remains to be done to achieve tangible outcomes, and that it takes a broad and global collaborative approach to effectively promote the rule of law and justice across all societies.
Throughout the pandemics and throughout the world, we have witnessed, unfortunately, a decline in the rule of law, the application of the rule of law, and Africa is no exception. The survey showed that out of 31 countries surveyed, 23 showed a decline in the rule of law. We should not let this pandemic derail us here in Africa in our path to progress in realizing the rule of law and realizing the rights of the people. So it is my hope that with such a tool, the Rule of Law Index, we will be able to move together and make stronger progress.
I found it interesting that to look at the correlation between the rule of law and development in Africa. Rule of law and the level of economic activities or the level of foreign investment in Africa. And then finally, we look again at the correlation between the rule of law and the overall score of governance. And we find in each case very strong correlation. I wish to congratulate our friends in the World Justice Project. Well done, and keep doing it, please, because we all need it. Thank you very much.
I find the report from World Justice Project very important for my work. First, when in Georgia, we, the civil society, request reforms of the judiciary, we have all the arguments here in this document, and we have well-proved reasons to ask for change to our government, because we claim that our judiciary should be more independent, more transparent, more upheld to the international human rights standards. I, as a human rights activist, feel very much empowered when I say that I'm not alone and that other human rights activists face the same issues, and we can unite our force and become more powerful to have better judiciary, better government, and better human rights situation in our countries.
It's very important for us in the health system to include in what we do a component of legality and legal issues, because we know on and on again how important it is to have such an index in all what we do, because it helps us to predict health, to protect health, predict education, protect education, predict economical development, protect economical development. What you are doing in this project is amazing. It is of a great value for us in health.
Why does Asian Development Bank talk about rule of law? In its strategy 2030, ADB calls for strengthening of governance and institutions, in particular the rule of law, for not only sustaining the benefit of its development work, but also to ensure that these benefits are widely and equitably shared. The central premise of ADB's Law and Policy Reform Program is that a functioning legal system that is anchored on the rule of law and that establishes and implements laws and regulations fairly, consistently, ethically, is essential component of sustainable economic development. We use this Rule of Law Index not only to gather information and statistics, but also to convince the governments that it is important for them to work in this area with us, because we have gathered this information from a very credible source of Rule of Law Index of the World Justice Project. So it gives us credibility, authority, with which we go and then talk to our partners in these countries. So thank you, World Justice Project, once again for doing this phenomenal groundwork for us.
So there you hear some perspectives from colleagues around the world about their use of this data. I should say these are clips of longer comments that we received from them, and we will be posting those to our YouTube channel later today, and I invite you to listen to them in their entirety. Let's turn now to the perspectives and questions from our audience. And let me begin with you, Alicia. We've got a question that goes to the survey process, and folks are wondering when exactly were these surveys conducted, and what can you share with us about some of the challenges you may have encountered in doing so this year during the pandemic?
Yeah, so the data was collected this year between October 2020 and May of 2021. So that was the period in which we administered our surveys. This was definitely a very challenging year. We've never seen anything like this or experienced something like this. But I think the biggest challenge for us was really that we had to delay data collection by about 6 months. So this, due to the pandemic and safety restrictions. So we had to really push back our schedule, and it kind of made us change our schedule a little bit. So that was a bit difficult. In addition, we really had to make a more concerted effort this year to engage with our experts and to really encourage participation from our experts, so that they would continue to take our surveys, and we would get greater number of surveys to really ensure that we had enough data for our scores this year. And we actually ended up having the most surveys this year that we have ever had that were factored into our index. So we're really excited about that.
Wonderful. Alex, let me turn to you with another question about understanding the data in the context of the pandemic. A number of our audience members are wondering about that. Is this downturn a short-term issue that we're encountering due to the pandemic, or should we understand it in another way?
That's a great question. I think half and half. I think thinking about the channels that we discussed before, the delays and problems of access in justice institutions, they're probably they arrive in a context of limited innovation and limited access, indeed. So a report or an estimate that the World Justice Project and the Pathfinders Task for Justice estimated before the pandemic was that approximately 5.1 billion people lacked access to justice. And this was due mainly because when they had a problem, they couldn't resolve it, they couldn't go to an institution, or the institution was slow or expensive, or they couldn't report a crime when they experienced one. So we had a situation of lack of access before the pandemic, but something that we didn't have was decreasing trends. So it was a bad situation, but not a decreasing situation. This is different when we look at the situation of the institutional checks. The pandemic arrived in a context in which the countries were experiencing declines. Institutions were weakening, the civic space was closing. As I mentioned before, this is the 4th year in a row in which more countries declined than improved in rule of law, and in particular in the constraints on government powers and fundamental rights. So then the pandemic accelerated those effects, spread those effects. And that's probably take more time for this to resolve. On the case of discrimination, it's a mix as well. There are probably components that are related more to the unequal effect of the pandemic. The pandemic affected vulnerable groups more prominently than other groups, and also the responses that the governments had also benefited more some groups more than others, that probably contributed to the rising perception of discrimination. But at the same time, there were some structural factors as well that probably have been going on longer periods. We haven't seen a decreasing trend in discrimination, but there were some factors there that are latent, and particularly for some countries, the countries that have been experiencing declines in the institutional checks also experienced declines this year in absence of discrimination, which speaks a little bit about the dynamics in those countries that may be contributing to these effects.
Very interesting. So it's a complex picture.
It is a complex picture.
Very.
It's a strength, though, I think, of the index methodology, that it allows us to look at these different factors and sub-factors and really dig in and analyze at that granular level what's going on. But overall, it seems that we can't expect just to bounce back after the pandemic, that there are some long-term trends and weaknesses that are going to be difficult to address over the long term.
Absolutely.
More questions coming, lots about specific countries, Alicia, and how it is that we choose specific countries for the index. We added 11 this year. Mm-hmm. Share with our audience kind of how we make those decisions, which countries are in the index.
Absolutely. So ideally, we would cover all countries in our index. That is our goal for one day, and we are slowly moving towards that goal. The way that we have historically selected countries is by population size. So our goal is to really represent the largest proportion of the world's population as possible. Currently, right now, we estimate that the index covers about 95% of the world's population. So in addition to population, we look at geographic and economic diversity. We want to make sure that we're covering all regions of the world and all different economic and income groups. In addition to that, we will look at feasibility of actually conducting polls in countries. In some countries, it's more difficult to conduct public opinion polls than in others, so that's something we have to factor into our decision. And finally, we also look at funding requirements. Sometimes we might have a particular donor who's interested in us adding a couple of countries to the index, so we may choose based on that. And it is a particularly expensive exercise to conduct these polls, so funding restrictions do limit our ability to expand in certain cases. But yeah, those are some of the ways in which we pick countries to add to the index.
Okay, very helpful. And let me follow up and ask you, how does WJP ensure that that data it collects is accurate and impartial, and we can rely on it?
Excellent question, and we get this question a lot. So we really check our data throughout the process of collecting it and calculating our scores. We'll start off with a pilot test or a smaller sample of our surveys to just check and make sure we're not seeing any anomalies in the data. Once we collect the data, we will review it and clean it, and again, check for any anomalies or strange things in the data that we might see. Then once we calculate our scores, we will go through and compare our scores to other quantitative and qualitative sources. This is our cross-checking process. So we will make sure that the scores, or check that the scores, see if they're in line with what other data collectors, data producers are saying about certain rule of law topics, and what the media is saying, current events, etc. So we check it against probably about 60 or 70 quantitative and qualitative third-party sources to see if we're collecting an accurate picture.
Great. And I should say you're very transparent about that methodology. There's lots of information about it on the website.
Yep.
Who our polling partners are, and
absolutely,
and the like. Great. Alex, let me ask you. We've got some questions about the U.S. Performance on rule of law over the last year. What can you tell us about the trends in the United States?
Yeah, the U.S. declined in this last edition of the index by 2.9%. The data was collected or reflecting the last months of the previous administration, but the trend, this negative trend, started in 2016. So this is a trend that we have seen over several years, and driven mainly by negative trends in constraints on government powers, absence of corruption, fundamental rights, discrimination, and criminal justice.
Okay. That's a further sobering note. Alicia, we heard from some of our colleagues about how they use the data. Share with us how you see partners around the world using this data in their work.
Well, we hope that our data is applicable to a lot of stakeholders around the world. We really think it can be used in a wide variety of ways. I think that our different stakeholders fall into probably 5 different buckets. First, we have the government users. So, for example, the government of Kosovo uses our data in their 5-year strategic action plan to improve the rule of law. And so that's a really interesting way in which governments can use our data to measure their progress against certain action plans that they develop. Second, we have multilateral organizations, so like the World Bank, the IMF, the OECD, the European Union, the Open Government Partnership. They all use our data in a variety of ways to track some of their member states' progress on different goals and objectives. We also have the private sector. They use our data in like in multinational corporations, rating agencies, for example. The U.S. Chamber of Commerce is a big user of our data, and in that context, it can be used to help make financial decisions if you're a rating agency or something of that sort. So it can be very useful to the private sector as well. We also have media and academics who use our data in research and to produce articles and think pieces, and then global and local non-governmental organizations. So a good example is Transparency International. In their Corruption Perceptions Index, they use some of our data to calculate that index and their scores. So it really can be used in a variety of ways, and we hope that more people will continue to use the data and find better uses for it.
Great. Alex, maybe we have time for one or two more questions. Let's see if we can find a positive note for the discussion. We've talked a lot about the downturn in rule of law in this pandemic year, but there were some countries that improved, notwithstanding the challenges posed by the pandemic. What can we learn from them? What can you tell us about that?
Yes, you're right, Betsy. Most of the countries declined in rule of law. And for those that improved, in general, the improvements were marginal. However, we can find some interesting stories, and probably we can put them in two categories. So the first one are countries that were experiencing sustained reform efforts, and they are essentially continuing through this trajectory. One example is Uzbekistan, that has been going through a reform process and show an improvement of approximately 4%, due mainly to strengths of institutional checks and the fight against corruption. Other examples are countries that, in front of the pandemic, took an approach, a more open approach and participatory approach, respecting fundamental freedoms, freedom of the media, freedom of expression, and informing citizens about the situation. That is example of New Zealand, for example, that improved in several categories during the past year and had an improvement of approximately 1% in the scores.
Excellent. Well, I think we have time for one quick last question that was just handed to me. It's an important one. Somebody's asking, do each of the 8 index factors hold equal weight in the methodology?
Great question, and absolutely, yes, they do. And we do this to make sure that we're not valuing one factor over another, one type of governance system over another. All 8 factors have the same weight and are calculated using the overall score is calculated using a simple average of those 8 factors.
Okay, wonderful. Well, I'm sure there are many more questions, both about the methodology and the findings. I encourage everyone to look at the information on the website, to engage with WJP and with this data going forward. We'd love to work with you to understand it, to help you use it, to inform your work, to strengthen the rule of law. To conclude our program, I'm going to turn for some final words to the chair of the World Justice Project Board, William Hubbard.
Thank you, colleagues, for joining us today. As you have heard, the results are in. The deterioration in the rule of law is spreading worldwide. For 4 years running, more countries have seen the rule of law decline than improve, with a dramatic jump in countries deteriorating over the past year. Constraints on government powers have weakened, and civic space has diminished, opening the door to growing authoritarianism. Discrimination has risen, and access to justice has taken a serious hit during the pandemic. Behind these statistics are people like you and me who depend on rule of law to create economic opportunity, to protect them from fraud and discrimination, to keep their communities safe and protect their rights. All of us have a role to play in raising awareness of these critical issues and advancing policies and practices that reinforce rule of law principles. We hope the World Justice Project Rule of Law Index will help you do so, and I invite you to consult the index and its insights at worldjusticeproject.org. Use and share them widely. This is valuable information to begin the hard work of reinforcing the rule of law foundation so needed in all of our communities. We have come to the end of our presentation. On behalf of WJP, I would like to thank the many people who have contributed to the World Justice Project Rule of Law Index 2021. We owe a special thanks to everyone who answered our surveys, and especially the expert practitioner respondents in public health, labor law, criminal justice, and civil and commercial law. I would also like to acknowledge the wonderful team at the World Justice Project for their great work in data collection and analysis. And a special thanks to Alejandro Ponce and Alicia Evangelides for their superb leadership of this work and their insights today. A final and most important thank you goes to all in the audience for your interest in this work and your involvement in this critical global effort to advance the rule of law. Thank you for connecting.